Hi, this is Ms. Hadi from Olympian High School. You've been reading about post-classical Western Europe, but now we're going to look at the social part. So if you're taking notes, you want to put this in the S part of your inspect chart. First thing we want to get out of the way is change in historiography. So make sure you understand that the word feudalism is how we used to refer to the social order that existed in Western Europe in post-classical times, but that word has become, well, some historians are abandoning it because it's simply too oversimplistic for what actually occurred. It sort of describes what European society as being this neat hierarchy, this neat hierarchical system, meaning it's not all equal, it's not egalitarian hierarchical system, where you have a system of lords and then people underneath them, retainers, and technically the lords themselves are underneath one of the Carolingian kings, but really they're just nominally, which means like nombre, name, loyal to that king, but in reality they did their own thing. So you have a system of lords and retainers, and on the surface it seems very organized, but that's not how it actually worked. It was often changed to meet the necessary demands in an ad hoc way. And so basically historians think it's just too complex, and potentially the word obscures rather than elucidates what is happening at the time. This is very highbrow, it's very intellectual, it's something you might discuss in college, but for now, just know that if you see the word feudal, it's talking about the system of lords and retainers that existed in Europe, where you have the cultivators growing the food, and then the retainers are receiving food, or they're receiving a fief, which is a parcel of land from the lord in exchange for fighting for the lord. And I'm going to explain that system in a minute. Make sure you know that word fief. They might also receive payments in kind, which are types of food. So let's get into it with that out of the way. The word feudal, you'll see it used in regular world history books, but in AP World History, we have this more nuanced way of studying society to account for these subtleties that maybe a regular world history class would miss. Okay, so as you know, the Carolingian Empire tried to bring back centralized imperial rule and failed. So you have some Carolingian kings still around, and there are people that are nominally loyal or have allegiance to them, but in reality, they're largely independent, and they're building their own armies. And the way they build those armies, you can see the ways that they're independent down here, is by recruiting retainers, by giving them parcels of land or income generated from a mill or payments in kind or even payments of money. And so these grants allow the retainers to devote themselves and focus on protecting and fighting for in the military of the Lord against invaders. So you learned from Mr. Hammond about the Magyars and the Vikings and the Muslims, all these different invaders. So this was like a decentralized way of keeping order, maintaining order. And so in exchange for their grants, the retainers owed loyalty, obedience, respect, counsel, and military service for their lords. Over time, this becomes a close relationship between the lords and their retainers, and they end up having the right or the prerogative to pass this on to their kids. And so they become like a hereditary noble class, these lords and their retainers. So it continues over time, but it could also become unstable because lords that have retainers might also be themselves a retainer to a higher lord. And then what if they end up fighting against another lord who has, so if there are two lords and both of them are retainers to a lord above them and they fight, it just gets really complicated. So you can read about this web of potential source of instability, since the retainers, could, act in their own interests rather than the interests of the lord. But for a long time, it did maintain order, and this was how many of the early states in Western Europe were built, through the system of lords and retainers. Okay, read about that on your own, and let's just review what I just taught you guys using this PowerPoint slide. So the local nobles took over administration from a weak central government in the form of the Carolingians. They had nominal allegiance to the Carolingian kings, but really they were increasingly independent. We talked about lords and retainers. They could have an incentive or like a reward of joining the army by receiving a fee for a land grant, income from mills, cash payments. Over time, this became a hereditary class. They did have other functions that they were responsible for, like maintaining justice and social welfare. You can read about that in your book. And this was a complex interrelationship where people could act in their own interest and rebellion was a possibility. Nevertheless, we have viable or working states that developed in Western Europe as a result of this. Okay, so make sure you remember that feudalism is an okay word to use, but a more highbrow way of thinking about it is that it was more complicated than just saying it was a feudal society. The bottom, you have the cultivators, and then you have the retainers and their lords, and then you have, the Carolingian kings. Okay, I hope that helped you understand society in post-classical Europe, Western Europe.